As you know, we have been organizing a series of webinars, talks by eminent personalities from different fields, and today's one is lecture 3 officially, and today we have invited Professor Debarshi Prasad Nath from Tezpur University. And I can see participants from all over the world, all over India, from different states, from universities and colleges. Many of them are teachers and research scholars, students, as well as general participants. I would like to welcome you all again, once again. And now I would like to request our Honorable Principal, sir, to inaugurate this webinar, to address you all. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Bhupen Chutia. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar. And as so, thank you, Bhupen Chutia. So, first of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar organized by IQAC Lakhimpur Girls College. As IQAC coordinator Dr. Chutia said, it is the lecture 3 of this webinar series organized by this college, and we have with us today Professor Debarshi Prasad Nath, and he will deliver a talk on literature in the time of crisis. In fact, we are very much delighted to have him with us for today, and I think from his lecture, the participants will be benefited, and we are very much thankful to him for giving his valuable time with us. And I am also thankful to Department of English, particularly for organizing his lecture here. So with these few words, I would like to declare this session open. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Now, I would like to invite our honorable speaker, Professor Debarshi Prasad Nath. He will be talking on literature in times of crisis. Professor Nath, sir, now the speaker is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I thank the organizers, Lakhimpur Girls College, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on what I believe is a very important and a very relevant topic for our times. And I am thankful particularly to the principal, to the coordinator, the IQAC, and all my colleagues there in North Lakhimpur Girls College, one of the best colleges, I must say, in the northern bank of the Brahmaputra. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I hope I'm audible. Is it okay? Is the voice getting through? Is the audio clear? Okay, right. The audio is okay, Bhupen?
Okay. It's all right. It's all right.
It's all right. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. Now, one feels, sort of slightly apprehensive about giving a talk to a general audience, because one doesn't really know what the expectations are, but one therefore doesn't know where to sort of begin. I'm sure that there will be certain things that will be said in the course of the talk that some of you might be familiar with, and there will be new things, I'm sure, that I might be having to say as well. But I can assure you of one thing: there will be fresh perspectives being presented. And, you know, I'm sure that we can mutually benefit from both this talk as well as the interactive session that we're going to have immediately after this. So I hope the screen is in place and you can all see this. Just to put things in perspective, I begin with reference to Tim Gillespie's very important article called "Why Literature Matters." And, you know, this is just to build up a perspective. And time and again in history, literature has been called upon to justify its relevance for society. So as students of literature, we have to face this question almost on a daily basis. I'm sure all of us are aware of this. This is a question that we are all asked, that do we need literature anymore? You know, of what use is this speculative business of literature when science has brought such certainty and such optimism to human life? And this has been particularly evident since the rise of industrial capitalism in Europe in the 18th century, which tended to measure everything in terms of material benefits and utilitarian concerns. It is in this context that literature has very often been reduced to a secondary role in society. Like Gillespie says, as you can read here, that literature has never been the main course, at least not in our times. It's there, it's considered to be important, but yet it seemed to be a seasoning. It seemed to be, you know, something that adds value, that's supplemental, but not really important. The fact of the matter is that literature can actually make very serious pedagogic interventions in education. And by this, I do not limit myself merely to classroom teaching. In fact, what I'm saying about literature is not mere academic sophistry, but these are proven facts that have been experimented with. A variety of disciplines have been successfully using literature as a device for deepening learning to manage crisis situations. And this has been happening particularly in the West. And as we see here, medical education particularly has a long and well-developed history of using novels and other works of literature to promote a more humanistic approach to patient care. And this is, I believe, a need of the times. In fact, you'd be surprised to know that even at Harvard Medical School, students are taught, you know, medical students are taught to examine works of literature which can help them to look beyond the conceptual categories of medical science. You know, to think as of the patients as not just patients, but as human beings. And to experience, therefore, the palpable pain and suffering of other human beings. That is what literature teaches us. The charge of irrelevance has quite often been leveled against literature, as I said, since the 18th century, and yet literature has survived, and it has survived well, and it has reminded us time and again about both the historical mistakes that are to be avoided by human beings and also the things that we need to be careful about in the future. And fiction particularly has started to address issues of social concerns more directly and aggressively today than ever before. And very often these works of fiction, they have reflected, you know, systems of injustice and inequalities that are existent in our societies. Some of them have done this speculatively. They have imagined dystopic world orders in which some or the other form of catastrophic event removes the thin veneer of civilization that covers human society. And literature has started to deal with uncertainties and anxieties that have been bred by the processes of globalization, by the market in a society which has apparently lost its purpose and meaning. Now, I believe, and I strongly contend, that literature gives us the courage to engage with uncertainties. And you see that particularly since the second half of the last century, there has been a tremendous rise in what is called dystopian fiction. Now, interestingly, if capitalism breeds anxieties and uncertainties, it also knows how to make business out of the same anxieties and uncertainties. So most of the reputed publishing houses of our times, most of the important movie production houses have started making money out of selling this dystopian stuff. And yet literature continues doing what it has always done best, that is to reflect the follies and the foibles of human societies, bringing out the best and the worst in humans. And crisis situations are definitely a test of human strengths and weaknesses. And these dystopian fictions that we're going to talk about, they have depicted this best of times, worst of times kind of scenarios. And they have taught us about the ethics of uncertainty in human life. And I believe that we need to learn from this ethics of uncertainty. Uncertainty, actually, if it is accepted as a way of life, I believe can definitely make better human beings out of us. It can actually teach us the value of life itself. And young people particularly surely need courage, but they do not need the kind of courage or the kind of valor that we used to cherish 500 years back. Not physical valor, but the courage to deal with uncertainty, to engage with uncertainty in a meaningful way. Now, how often have we heard this cliche that literature is a mirror of life? I beg to disagree. I believe that literature is much more than a mirror. In fact, literature reveals what the mirror hides. The mirror does not tell us the complete truth. What the mirror offers is a pleasing certainty. It shows what is pleasing to the eyes, and the mirror, therefore, lies. Literature teaches us to be critical of what appears to be certain, predictable, and non-ambiguous. Literature actually transforms amorphous human fears into a concrete reality. Uncertainties are unsettling for all of us because uncertainties tear away at the very fabric of our socio-political and our individual existence. Thus, contemporary life is a continual struggle to overcome the uncertainties of life. And particularly so for a life that is guided solely by the prerogatives of utility and practicality, uncertainty is unacceptable. Now, in this context, one is reminded of this wonderful novel, young adult dystopian novel, The Giver by Louis Laurie, which tells us the story of a young boy called Jonas, who has a special gift that allows him to have flashes of color in a world that has done away with it completely. We are talking about a world in which uncertainties have been completely done away with. This novel depicts a situation where life is completely sanitized of all uncertainties. People have eliminated crime, they have eliminated war, they have eliminated disease, they have eliminated music, literature, and all kinds of strong emotions and uncertainties. And they have controlled population growth, they have regulated environmental development, and even the terrain is controlled. They even control the weather. But with all these improvements, they sacrifice love, passion, music, and color, And in spite of the fact that there is contentment in this society, there is no happiness. There is no dignity. There is no difference. There is only sameness in this world. Now, in the course of this talk, I will be taking resort in philosophy from time to time, and also in the discipline of history, to establish some of the arguments that I'll be making. And when I was thinking about the COVID-19 virus and the situation that we are currently facing, I was reminded of the works of three philosophers, Jacques Derrida, Lacan, and Viktor Frankl. You might be wondering what is the connection between these three. Well, let me throw some light on that. Now, interestingly, not many people have taken note of this, but in an interview in the year 1994, Derrida had said that the virus is in part a parasite that destroys, that introduces disorder into communication. It is something that is neither living nor non-living. I'm sure that all of you have some idea about where Derrida comes from when he says this. He's dealing with the aspect of undecidability of language. And in that context, he finds the example of the virus a wonderful trope with which to talk about undecidability. You know, the virus is something that defies any easy or neat categorization, as it is neither dead nor alive. I don't know if any of us have thought about it that way. You know, this is the interesting thing about the virus, not just the COVID virus, but all kinds of viruses. Viruses defy any kind of neat categorization. And this undecidability is the most terrifying aspect of a virus. It is impossible to pin it down to one thing or the other. So, presently faced with the COVID-19 crisis, uncertainty has become a feature of daily life. Everything is uncertain and unclear. Derrida talked about the undecidability and the uncertainty, which adds to the terrifying aspect of a virus. But in reality, we are experiencing this today in our real lives. We are unable to come to terms with the changed order or the lack of order of life that the COVID-19 virus has brought about. Now, we all, have these questions in our mind. Like, is it going to have a second or third cycle? What percentage of the countries or the world's population will constitute the asymptomatic carriers? How much will the virus mutate across time and space? By the time we discover the vaccine, would it have already undergone enough mutation to resist the former? And, is there a fear of reverse mutation? Some people are talking about the dangers of reverse mutation as well. And no one has any answers for these questions. Economists are as unsure as the biologists. But this undecidability has to be thrust aside. See, in order for us to have a meaningful life, we have to pretend that things are under control. The state has to pretend that things are under control. And how do we go on pretending that things are under control? We set up rigorous regimes of surveillance and order. So we're talking about quarantining and the other such stuff, the measures that we have taken up all over the world in order to protect ourselves from this lack of meaning which threatens us. Because otherwise it will drive us all insane. It will lead to a complete chaos, a complete breakdown of the social order. And how do we respond to such a situation? We have begun tracking down carriers in the most sort of dehumanizing way that we can think of. We have developed these dehumanizing tactics of keeping count of mathematical numbers like physical information. How many people are down with the COVID virus today? That's just a mathematical fact that we are comfortable with. We are doing this in order to sort of grapple, hold on to something, hold on to meaning. I don't know if you have noticed this, but even the environmentalists, who are generally spot on about such issues, they feel threatened by this undecidability. In fact, the virus, we are told, is nature's revenge upon man. I think this is silly, because apart from the pathetic fallacy of imagining nature as displaying the supremely mundane human quality of revenge, this way of thinking has another pitfall. Man is at the center of the universe, even in defeat. See, this is the sum and substance of what is being said. He, above all, is being singled out by nature for special treatment. It is to teach him a lesson that nature is working. And with this, I believe we have successfully crossed all limits of what I call homogotism, or the egotism of Homo sapiens, the sense that man confers meaning on everything. Before Derrida, Lacan had also written about and dealt with this idea of undecidability, of course, in a different way, in a different sense, but he did talk about undecidability that characterizes human life, the undecidability that we must sort of continually trust aside to go on living meaningful lives. And if you remember, Lacan talked about the three registers of life: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is the register of imagined wholeness where none exists. It is the imagined wholeness of the body when the human infant is not yet able to have any controls over its own body parts. And the symbolic order is the sphere of language, the cozy world of meaning and certainty. This is the register in which we plan to and we spend our lives. But then there is the continual threat of the real. And this is the order that I'm particularly interested in here, because the real defies any attempt at explanation by virtue of the simple fact that it is beyond language. You see, you can only talk about things, you can only express yourselves through language. But the real, according to Lacan, is something that exists beyond the realm of language. So how do you talk about something that you cannot explain with the help of language? Therefore, the real is something that breaks down the meaning structures of language to throw everything into chaos. Literature, I contend, is one way of accessing the inaccessible. It is one way of accessing the real. See, different people have responded differently to the COVID-19 virus. Many have resorted to denial, pretending that life goes on as usual. Some others have decided that it is best to submit to fate. But generally, the prevailing atmosphere is one of fear and uncertainty, because people find this undecidability tormenting. It threatens to, as we say here, tear us apart with meaninglessness and emptiness. And the nearest that we can ever come to an experience of the real is through art, through an experience of the sublime, art and literature. The real is the ultimate truth. It is a truth that is not contingent upon our sense perceptions. In fact, it is independent of it. So, whereas in Derrida, we have an instance of all traces of meaning being completely smothered, Lacan retains it in the form of the real. Now, we are a generation that is obsessed with the idea of visible enemies. The invisibility of the virus, therefore, is a threatening prospect for us. Do you realize that we have started popularizing images of the virus in popular culture? I'm told that even COVID-19 shipped sweets are being sold in the market today. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because this is a desperate attempt to see the enemy. Because when we see the enemy, we control it. But the danger is that this tendency to search for visible enemies is so pervasive and so common that there is every likelihood of it being exploited for, political gains. Now, we are talking about uncertainties. Does that mean that there are no certainties left in this world? There are certainties, definitely. Certainties have not disappeared completely. And of the few certainties that still remain in our world, we have hunger, we have compassion, and these are powerful, compelling certainties. And these powerful certainties have forced us to build narratives of meaning in a universe where everything seems to be falling apart. Man succeeds in spite of everything to create meaning in life. And, this is what will help us succeed. In this context, I was reminded of the philosopher Viktor Frankl. And you must be aware of the fact that he personally experienced sheer hopelessness and meaninglessness of life in the concentration camps during the Second World War. And his book, Man's Search for Meaning, it tells us how man can retain his dignity even in the face of the greatest odds. And, he gives a description of life that he experienced in the concentration camps in those days. Say, for instance, here we have these lines. You can see for yourself that, as he says, everything can be taken away from a man, but there's one thing that you cannot take away from him, and this is the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's way. So as long as human beings are able to find a why for their existence, they can almost put up with any kind of how. You see, particularly, I find Frankl's conceptualization of this idea of tragic optimism particularly valuable. Because, tragic optimism is the kind of optimism that man displays in the face of tragedy, which allows human beings to turn their suffering into an accomplishment. You are able to invest meaning in your suffering. You are able to change for the better, so there is a redeeming aspect of it as well. And you are also inspired by the transitoriness of life to take responsible action. Now, in literature, we have come across the sense of tragic optimism quite often. In fact, there's a long list of books that tells us about man's stoicism, even in the midst of the greatest adversities. In fact, if you have noticed, literature tends to flourish in times of crisis and in times of uncertainty. In this context, one is reminded, of course, of The Old Man and the Sea, or Tom Wolfe's Man in Fool, or even Hardy's Kiss of the D'Urbervilles. Now, we very often have instances of writers moving beyond tragic optimism. And there are writers who have imagined alternative possibilities for the future. This future might be bleak and uncertain, but it will expose human beings for what they are. Stripped bare and reduced to mere animal existence, like King Lear, man will survive only if he continues to have faith in humanity and he is able to learn the lessons of history. And literary writers have often imagined man facing such a litmus test in critical dystopias. And one of the best examples that one can think of in this context is, of course, Albert Camus' The Plague, which was about a plague that had ravaged the Algerian city of Oran. And one of the main points that Camus is making here in this novel is that human existence gains meaning only when people choose to freely participate in the losing but noble struggle against death and suffering. So the most important question in life is, how do we choose to respond to death? There's a warning in the novel. The warning is that a virus can lie dormant in society, but it can wake up anytime. It can come back to life anytime. Similarly, the virus of fascism also could rise again. So literally and metaphorically, the plague in the novel serves us a warning that the pestilence could come back to life. The Nazis could be back again. Human life is full of misery, pain, and suffering, but still there can be peace, happiness. For those who know that if there is one thing one can always yearn for and sometimes attain, it is human love. And the plague is, as you know, it's an expression of the philosophy of the absurd that Camus himself believed in. But his philosophy of the absurd was different from the other practitioners, like, say, for instance, Samuel Beckett, because he still believed that human beings have agency. There is always a conflict between our desire for value and meaning and our inability to find meaning in a meaningless and irrational universe. Remember what he said about life itself? He had said that human beings are born without a reason. They prolong their lives out of weakness and they die by chance. So what he reflects that kind of an attitude, but at the same time, he's also quick to remind us that the responsibility is on us to enjoy the beauty and goodness around us and also to create our own meaning in an objectively meaningless world. So literature is thus, quite well equipped to deal with uncertainties and fear, even in the midst of an all-encompassing sense of, hopelessness. It can make us aware of hope and meaning in life. And reading literature allows students to develop greater empathy with people in crisis, because individuals are then seen as real people with strengths, weaknesses, and feelings. We can, for instance, use empathy-evoking films to reduce this us versus them kind of thinking and break through resistance, to examine students' pre-existing positions on complex issues. And novels promote critical thinking when students apply concepts to cases by completing assignments for which there are no answers which are readily obtainable from published sources or from books. And stories evoke strong emotion and arouse different neural sort of pathways in the limbic system that may help to focus attention and to consolidate memory. Now, science fiction is a good example of this. Science fiction has been doing this for a long time. Talk about scientific utopias or dystopias, and they have always been reminding us of the radical possibilities that the future might hold. You have a sense of what I'm talking about when you read Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale or George Orwell's 1984. Literature actually has never run away from uncertainties. It has striven to create meaning out of chaos. It has often taught us that man's search for meaning in life does not cease in uncertainties. It only gains in intensity. And Tagore's play, Rabindranath Tagore's play, The Post Office, was staged in front of a bunch of kids who were just about to be taken away to the concentration camps. You must be aware about the story of the post office. It tells us the story of this little boy called Amal, who is afflicted by a fatal disease, and that is about to kill him. And his life is limited to the four walls of a room which he is confined. We know that he's going to die sometime very soon, but he expects a visit from the king. And one day, the play ends with hope, in the sense that one day Amal receives a message from the messenger of the king. This play was staged in the orphanage that was run by a gentleman called Janusz Korczak, who was a social activist in the Warsaw ghetto. And just before he and the children were taken to Treblinka by the Nazis to be killed in a gas chamber. Now, one reason why literature becomes more relevant in times of crisis is the fact that literature belongs to the domain of the subjective and the affective. In times of crisis, people experience pain and suffering. Such pain and suffering can only be expressed through the affective and the subjective. In normal situations, it is this affective and subjective aspects of life that are pushed aside by the demands of modern science and economics. Now, I came across this very interesting book called Philosophy and Literature in Times of Crisis by Michael Mack, where he tells us how contemporary science and economics are completely in the thrall of the substantive and objective facts or issues. One is reminded in this context of the character of Thomas Grind in Hard Times, who has this mindless obsession with numbers and statistics, with facts and figures alone. This fascination with the substantive and objective is also seen in the obsession that medical science, according to Michael Mack, has developed in recent times, the idea of longevity and immortality. Michael Mack points to the fact that a lot of effort in recent times of medical science has gone into prolonging the length of human life, but it has not been devoted enough to the amelioration of human pain and suffering. When it comes to relief from pain and suffering, we still turn to literature, we still turn to the arts, we still go back to the films. And, in this context, I was reminded of this very interesting response of Cecilia Jupe in Hard Times, when the teacher in the classroom asked her that what does she think about a hypothetical situation where the classroom is like a country, and suppose there are 1,000 students in the classroom and only 2 or 3 of them are dead from a disease and the rest are happy. So the teacher asked her that wouldn't she think that the entire classroom was happy? And her response is that, a sensible response to this question is that to the families of those dead people, those dates are actually quite significant. You cannot measure that in terms of numbers. So a situation like a pandemic, say for instance, brings out the best and the worst in human beings. But as literature, has shown us, even in the midst of all this suffering and angst, there will always be stories of love, sacrifice, and bravery that will be displayed by ordinary people. In fact, stories about coping with pandemic-like situations are very old. Thinking of literature depicting life in times of crisis, one is of course reminded of Giovanni Boccaccio's remarkable work, Decameron, which was written shortly after the Black Death in Europe, and we have 10 characters telling each other 10 stories each, and they tell themselves these stories to stay safe of the plague and also to create their own community of equality and prosperity. And the book begins with a graphic description of the devastation that is caused by the plague in the city of Florence. The plague offers the frame through which the stories are told, and thus, as I say here, storytelling itself becomes a way of staying clear of trouble, both a way of expressing matters of the heart openly and also avoiding the plague by keeping busy with the stories. Back in the 17th century, John Donne wrote this book called Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, in which he talks about illness as a metaphor for life. And he reminds us that the one thing that connects, that unites all humanity is the commonality of death. We are in this world together, and we must find ways to cooperate if we want to make the best of the good and the bad in life. We have these beautiful lines in this book that I keep going back to. I just like to read these lines. I cannot resist the temptation to read this once more. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So remember, every time the bell tolls, it tolls for thee and for me. In the 18th century, Daniel Defoe, the man who's famous for his Robinson Crusoe, he wrote a journal of the plague year. And there's an interesting description here that we can immediately identify with. It is actually a work of fiction, but he includes a lot of statistics, data, and charts in order to introduce the typical codes of verisimilitude that he was so famous for. This was the demand of 18th century fiction, that he introduced the codes of verisimilitude. Remember the descriptions in Robinson Crusoe, where he gives us the exact measurements of the fence that Crusoe erects around his house, right? And if you read some of the passages in this book, you will be surprised that some of the situations that were faced by people in those days, 300 years back, was exactly the same situation that we are facing today. Say, for instance, there's a description of people walking in the middle of the streets instead of walking on the sides. People would walk in the middle of the streets in order to maintain physical distancing, in order to stay clear of the infected. People would walk in the middle of the street, and they were also apprehensive about the fact that they could be infected by the smells and the scents coming out from the houses that were infected. And this second quotation that I put up here is actually a reference to a kind of notice that was issued for the watchman, which reflects the idea of quarantining, 300 years back. Read this notice. It says that to every infected house there be appointed 2 watchmen, one for every day and the other for the night, and that these watchmen have a special care that no person go in or out of such infected houses, whereof they have the charge upon pain of severe punishment. So you can see the idea of physical distancing, the idea of quarantining here. And then there is this beautiful line again, that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims. And as far as possible, one must refuse to be on the side of the pestilence. Remember, we always have this choice, as Camus tells us. We have a choice to choose between the pestilence and the victims. And we as human beings have to be on the side of the victims. Mary Shelley was a writer who was way ahead of her times. You know, if you read her The Last Man, which was written in 1826, it is about a survivor narrative, which is based in the year 2073. And it depicts a futuristic world that is ravaged by a plague and by the fanaticism of man. And it reflects the deep-seated anxieties of the author about the Industrial Revolution. And it is also, of course, a criticism of the Enlightenment's faith in reason and science. Now, as I was thinking of this book, I was suddenly reminded of another recent book that I had read, a new one. And you must all be familiar with this book, which has been very popular. I think it was published in 2017. Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, where he had said that epidemics are a thing of the past now. Medical science has made such tremendous progress in recent times that with our vaccinations, antibiotics, improved hygiene and whatnot, we are past the age of epidemics. This is a book that was written in 2017 or 18, and Mary Shelley's novel was written in 1826. 200 years back, she had predicted what was going to happen, or what was the likelihood of something like this happening in times to come, if man succumbed blindly to the this thing of, in the Enlightenment's kind of faith in religion and science. Now, much before this, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, they often used to discuss matters of death and disease. And whether it was Homer or Sophocles, it is clear that the conception of sin pervaded the Greek consciousness. But the thought of sin, of course, or disease itself, as an offense that was committed against the gods. Now, that offense could be committed voluntarily or involuntarily. In most cases, in ancient Greek literature, the sin that caused diseases was done involuntarily. You know, remember Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, where he says, "Not willingly am I detained, but I must have sinned against the deathless gods." So there is this idea of involuntary or unconscious sin that the Greek writers used to explore. And, you know, in this context, one is reminded of a very interesting book of history that was written by this gentleman called Tousidus. The book called History of the Peloponnesian War, which was about the Athenian plague, right? And for the first time, we have in history a gentleman who was looking at disease, probably as not the result of supernatural intervention, but as something that is, the result of, of nature itself. And his intention in documenting this, the disease itself was to make people aware about its spread so that they could guard themselves against future outbreaks. In fact, Tousidus, he listed the symptoms of the disease. And he said that the initial symptoms of the Athenian plague included headaches, conjunctivitis, rashes in the body, and fever. And this was followed by, coughing up of blood and extremely painful stomach cramping and vomiting and retching. And, interestingly, Tousidus, even though this is a book of history, he noted the decline in morality and honor in Athens during the time of the plague. So if you look at the last line, particularly of this quotation, it's saying, people resolve to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches as alike things of a day. This is almost like the carpe diem motif, enjoy the day while it lasts. And you know, a few centuries later, of course, even in the Bible, the plague was viewed as a God's punishment for sin. And there's a frightening description of its spread, which was interpreted as a warning to the people of Israel to behave morally or suffer the consequences. Now, in the 20th century, of course, there has been an explosion of literature, particularly of fictional literature on the matter of pandemics and other such cataclysmic events. There have been novels like Stephen King's The Stand, Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, Jose Saramago's Blindness, which all offer a sort of cathartic release of emotions of hopelessness in the times of crisis. And most of these novels, they deal with the failure of institutions, including states, to humanely deal with such problems. In these stories of survival, there is always a set of characters who emerge stronger than ever and who learn to be more humane and tell us about the great value of human camaraderie. These are stories about human resilience and stoicism. But more importantly, they help us to humanize the victims. The victims cannot just be numbers. And you know, in this case, I'd like to make a special mention here of Saramago's Blindness, which I think is brilliant in its exposition of almost the entire range of human emotions, all the shades of human nature: love, loyalty, jealousy, bravery, heroism, cowardice, you know, violence, happiness, disappointment. You have it all here. It is dark at times, but the novel is actually, you know, in the novel, the writer is anticipating the kind of chaotic situation that we actually are witnessing in quarantine centers today. And the background of the story is the onset of an illness or an epidemic of blindness that sweeps through an unnamed city. And the regression of human civilization is pretty fast. And it does not take a long while for the pillars of progress to come crumbling down. And Saramago's fantastic vision allows us to consider human nature in its true light. You know, just think of a comparative study between Orwell's 1984 and Saramago's Blindness. Orwell's 1984, remember, was about the panoptic vision. Saramago's novel is about the lack of vision. So this comparison would be very, very interesting. There is another novel that one has to talk about, that is Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, which was written in 1912. And he had imagined the global epidemic in the year 2013. And he was not, as you can see, a long way off the target. And he imagined that this would kill almost all the people in California and presumably on Earth. And in this novel, this Scarlet Plague, you know, causes its victims to become red-faced before they die. And the incidents in the novel are recalled 60 years later, in the year 2073, by the only surviving pandemic, you know, the survivor of the pandemic, who was, interestingly, a one-time professor of English literature. And this quotation, I find it very interesting because it raises the same doubts that afflict all of us when we see our societies being ravaged by diseases. Why is it that the unjust are spared by diseases? Why is it that the violent, the cruel are spared by diseases and the good perish? So we begin to doubt, you know, the idea of divine providence itself. And, you know, Jack London's novel, it depicts, you know, he foresaw some of the things that we are presently using in our times, like wireless communication. And he also envisages the growth of capitalism and he said that America would be run by billionaires, and the president of the United States of America, in fact, is appointed by a board of magnates, a dozen rich men who fund and who rule everything. This is too important to have been left out by Indian writers. The Indian writers have, of course, also dealt with the idea of disease and the kind of crisis situation that it causes in life. And one is, of course, immediately reminded of Ahmed Ali's Twilight in Delhi, which is which gives us a tradition of how the Spanish flu affected Indians in around the summer of 1918. And in fact, he says that there was hardly any family that was not visited by death during that time. In fact, India was one of the focal points of that epidemic, which killed around 15 million people worldwide. And out of that, we are told that around 10 million people in India died during the Spanish flu. And it seems we have forgotten about that already. You see, this is the number of people that we lost in the Spanish flu was more than any other country in the world. And yet we no longer talk about it as much as we probably should have been. Suryakant Tripathi's memoir, A Life Misspent, also provides a heartrending account of the same Spanish flu and how it ravaged India during the early period of the 20th century. Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay, of course, used the motif of disease almost in all his works. Particularly, malaria is an inevitable part of rural life. In fact, it can be said about Sarat Chandra that he aestheticized illness. Premchand's wonderful little story of Idgah, remember, the child protagonist loses his parents to Haiza. Similarly, in Anantamurti's Samskara, we have a description of how the villagers are afflicted by the bubonic plague. In Assam, a recent novel by Dhrubajyoti Bora, that is Ezar, it deals with the ravages of Kolazar. So much of the experiences that we're going through during this period of COVID-19 are actually amazingly similar to the speculations that we come across in dystopic literature of the last 2 centuries. And literature actually has been raising some of these threats that we are facing in our times, such as the threat of climate change, the barbarism of colonialism and the continuing dangers of colonialism, the dangers of the onslaught of pandemics and the endless greed of man. And all of these fictions use the trope of end of the world as we know it, seeking to answer the question, what is it in our societies that we would have liked to change? There are 5 novels from the 21st century, very recent ones that I have picked up. We'll quickly skim through these novels, which tell us about these post-apocalyptic societies where the survivors struggle to stay alive. We have Dion Mayer's Fever, which is set in South Africa, and it's about a post-apocalyptic society in which there is a long journey being undertaken by a father and a son. And we are told that a terrible disease has wiped out most of humanity, and Nico, the protagonist, he travels in this uninhabited wasteland along with his father, and in the hope of survival. Finally, they set up base, they set up a community, and but the stability of this community is constantly under threat from within and from without. As members of the community, they threaten to break away, and there are raiders from outside, but always looking out for, looking to sort of swoop down on this community and loot their scarce reserves. So the novel offers plenty of food for thought, and as brave, smart people begin to develop a replica of the modern world. So it's given a choice: what are the things in this old world that you would like to retain, and what are the things that you would like to do away with? And some of the characters learn from the past, some do not. But the goodness of people, the essential goodness of people, is evident. Then we have Emily St. John Mendel's Station 11, which presents a wonderful description of the changes in the world after a disaster strikes. And it subjects the idea of happiness to scrutiny in a world which is, world with the obvious advantage of hindsight. Of course, looking back, we can always, be wiser about the past. The novelist suggests that even a major catastrophe might only manage to cripple the world, but cannot ruin it, because the vast majority of survivors will retain their essential goodness. And most of the characters of Station 11, they remain good at heart, and they retain both the deep and superficial aspects of the old world. Interestingly, in this novel, in the post-apocalyptic society, Shakespeare survives. Shakespeare survives as well as popular culture. And one of the slogans of the characters that becomes almost like a motto in the novel is "survival is insufficient." This is a line that has been taken from Star Trek, the Voyager episode. And this is very interesting. So Mendel raises very important, very pertinent questions about life and things which we ask us most of the time till disaster strikes. And then we realize that we have been spending time in meaningless, inconsequential things, and we have been only minimally connected to the world around us. So we realize the true importance of things only when they are gone. Colson Whitehead's Zone 1 is a zombie-based apocalyptic novel, and I find it very interesting because it, for those of you who are familiar with this zombie-based apocalyptic fiction and who have been following this, you'd be aware that about the movement of the zombie, the typical zombie, and the staggering movement that it has. Well, here Whitehead comes up with two categories of zombies. One is the usual kind that you are already used to seeing in popular culture, and this new one is called the staggers. Okay, and the staggers are a minority group, and very interestingly, they are frozen in time and space, and they keep doing what they enjoyed doing most while they were alive. Say, for instance, if they were fond of shopping, they spend time only in the shopping malls. You cannot take them away from that. Claire Coleman's Terra Nullius, which means no man's land, is an extremely interesting novel. It's a new one. It's based in Australia, and it's actually about Australia's violent colonial history. And this violent colonial history of Australia is compared to an attack of aliens. Suppose aliens take over our planet tomorrow. How different will that situation be from our country being taken over by the colonial masters? As the novel, describes and follows the journey of this young man called Jackie, who is running away from an outpost, from a missionary outpost. It takes us a long time to realize that it's not a post-colonial or a colonial situation that is being described here, but it's actually, a situation, a post-apocalyptic society in which aliens have taken control of our world, and the book tells us, it develops a scathing commentary on the systems of depredations and injustices that are all too familiar for us who have been through colonialism, right? In this context, I must also mention that Grace Dillon, the race theorist, she uses this very interesting term called indigenous futurisms to talk about the way in which different indigenous communities of the world have imagined the apocalypse. For these people, for these indigenous people of the world, the apocalypse has already come. So no COVID-19 is going to threaten them. They have already faced this situation, what we are living through. And finally, there is Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a profoundly moving story of, again, a father and a son duo. And it's a wonderful description of destructiveness of a landscape that is completely barren, that has been laid to waste, but yet where hope survives because there is love. And how two people manage to survive in the midst of total devastation, right? So I'd like to conclude here that the crisis worker today, and when I say crisis worker, I mean each and every one of us. We need to be aware of how we have to make a meaningful human connection with the person in crisis. And reading works of literature provides an individual with an immersive experience into actual human lives. And we can learn from the perspectives of a variety of characters about how to deal with such situations. And I believe that literature should be used to teach crisis intervention. I found this very interesting that Pramod Nair has also raised this very important question, that pandemic literature has sought to raise quite often about why or what are the things that are important in pandemic literature. Whose suffering is more important? These are political questions, and these are questions that we need to look at. Whose dates are more grievable, as Butler said. The dates of some people are always more grievable than the dates of some others. So pandemic literature can help us to learn from the past, and then they can tell us about how to respond better to crisis. It can also have a cathartic impact on human fears about changes. And finally, how do you control a chaotic situation? Control a chaotic situation by telling or reading a story about it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again, Professor Nath.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was really an enlightening session, and we have got many feedback from our participants. Now, I would like to start the interaction session.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sir, I have a question.
Right.
In the initial part of the presentation, you said that dystopic literature is closely connected to ethics of uncertainties, and it is actually a product of capitalism. So how do we, but we cannot ignore the fact that the dystopic literature that has been emerging is a product of capitalism as well. I mean, the literature that is produced or the various art forms that is produced is because of capitalism, I guess. I hope you understand my question.
Thank you so much, Murchana. But that is precisely what I had said. Actually, that is exactly what I had said. I said that, capitalism breeds anxieties, capitalism breeds uncertainties. And so capitalism basically creates those situations where we have to create dystopic literature. But capitalism also knows how to make business out of those same uncertainties. See, that is the thing about capitalism. It sells the same uncertainties and anxieties back to us. Right? That is precisely the point that I was making.
So how do we differentiate between ethical presentation of crisis and the business that has been emerging from this genre of literature?
No, see, that is a question, that is a very important question and a fundamental question, I believe, that is related not just to dystopic literature, but to all kinds of literature, all kinds of films. Now, I believe that in spite of all of this, as Kemu argued and as I pointed out in a different context, there is still something called human agency. Human beings, particularly the artists and the creators, still have the ability to get on top of the situation in which they find themselves and give us these wonderful messages of hope and of love, of compassion, right? So it's possible. It's possible. I mean, we cannot imagine that even though we are saying that, dystopic literature or dystopic films in some ways are the products of capitalism, it doesn't mean that it can be completely taken over by anyone. No ideology can completely take over an entire branch of literature. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
There's a question from, the name is not there. Can you hear me? Would you like to say there is a...
So there is a question from a participant.
Okay, please.
Barsha, no, okay, the name has not been given. He or she, they would like to know that, would you say that there is a connection between Yeats's poem, the Second Coming, and the current pandemic situation?
Yeats's poem, The Second Coming.
Yes, sir.
That was more religious, I believe. That has its own religious underpinnings. So I didn't want to go into that kind of a it's possible, of course, to look at it that way. Definitely possible, but definitely possible. Yes, it's possible.
There is one more question, sir, by
Please.
Barsha. She would like to know. Okay. She would like to add a few things on the thing that you spoke. She would like to add on the range of philosophies you brought forth and located in context of the pandemic about Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence, and it stands very true to a suffering reader, according to her. And it essentially provides another tangent to the whole discussion of literature in the time of crisis.
Sure, there's so much more to add. I mean, that's beyond the scope of my lecture. There's so much more that could have been said about this. There is Susan Sontag, for instance. I thought, more sensible, this thing would have been to include Susan Sontag. But then I would request the organizer sometime in the future to give me another opportunity to talk about Susan Sontag herself. So yes, there are plenty of things. There are plenty of other things that could be said, but there is a particular line of reasoning. There is a particular line of argument that I was following, to which I stuck. And there's limited time. So yes, maybe next time we can do that as well. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to request our Anand sir to offer thanks. You have questions? I think he has a question also.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a small question.
Yes.
So you emphasized at a certain point that importance should be given on why do we live. Then that will automatically lead to how we will live. But at the same time, you also told about pretending that things are under control
is also important. So we solve the problem if we just pretend that things are all under control. Will it really solve the issue? That is my precise question.
Sir, I'm afraid you got me wrong. I was saying just the opposite of that. I was saying that, it is the state and the government that pretends that things are under control. Things are not at all under control. That is precisely what the whole talk was about. The whole talk was about how we have absolutely run out of control and we are only pretending that we are controlling the situation, right? So this is unprecedented. We have absolutely no control. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
There's a question.
It's by Garima Borwa. She asks, how do we represent the situation of caste in Assam, which is itself a less discussed Assam, and how pandemics and epidemics affect these categories, so to say? How do we insert the invisible instances of resistance into dominant literature?
Oh my God, that's a huge topic in itself, Garima. I mean, is it about caste? Is it about caste? Murchona, was it about caste?
Yes, sir, she particularly asked about caste system, about the caste.
Okay. I think there is some attempt to do with that. Dhrubasuti Bora's novel, Azar, and well, not. I mean that would be an entirely area in itself, and we may, we could take it up later as a separate topic of discussion, and maybe I'll think about this, and if Garima is really interested, she could also get my mail from Bhupen, and we could keep this discussion going about caste and disease, if I get it right, because that's a huge area in itself, and how caste equations have been affected by the coming of the COVID-19, particularly, that in Assam, in the context of Assam. That's in fact food for thought for me. Thank you, Garima. We'll take that up. We'll discuss this. Thank you.
So there is one more question.
Okay.
By Abhijit Sil. He would like to know about your opinion on the pandemic and whether it will give birth to new emerging genre of literature, and how will you look into it?
How do I look into something that is not yet born, presumably? But, yes, I definitely think that there is going to be a lot of literature after this. It's definitely going to have an impact on artists and writers alike across the spectrum, across genres. There will be plenty of movies being made. There will be plenty of novels being written on this. But I cannot exactly predict about what kind of genre that would be. And, it's difficult for me at this stage when I am plagued by my own uncertainties. Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you.
Sir, one more question, if you won't mind.
Please.
This is by okay. She would like to know if you spoke about literature reflecting society as it is, about being a mirror. In addition to being a mirror, she would like to know if literature also has a responsibility to be sensitive towards a crisis or the people affected by it. And she would like you to know that she speaks in context of the enormous amount of literature emerging, documenting the oppression faced by sections affected by the lockdown amid the COVID-19 crisis, especially the early stages of the migrant crisis? Isn't the literature produced in that case a little premature and dehumanizing?
My talk was precisely about that. My talk was precisely about the kind of situation that we could land up in the future, and how best we can do something to stop this process of dehumanizing, right? If we had actually been more avid literatures of literature, the world would have been a much better place, I believe. The world would definitely have been a much better place if people had actually, and I seriously and honestly mean this when I say that we need people to be more appreciative of, genuinely appreciative of literature and the arts, and the cause and the role that it has played in helping us to think of people as victims, people as human beings with pain and suffering, and not just zombies. Yes, I can see Bhupen raising his hand.
Somebody else?
So Pankaj Lochan Das is raising his hand. Pankaj, you can ask your question. You'll write, or you can write your question. Pankaj, you can write your question. बेटा पंकज प्रश्नटा करिसे
Hello. Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, perfectly. Please.
Okay. Okay, sir. I just want to know, is it pertinent to have indecisibility in literature?
Is it pertinent?
Yes. Is it compulsory or is it necessary to have undecisibility in literature?
No, nothing is obligatory on the part of the writer. Nothing is obligatory. No, I don't think so. We can absolutely, we cannot have a condition, we cannot have a situation where we make any kind of ideology, even if that be of uncertainty, to be mandatory for any literature, for any writer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. One more thing, just, sir, I want to know, can we take the examples of, you can say, graphic novels?
Sorry, of?
Graphic novels.
Okay. Yes, we can certainly do that. Actually, my own reading of graphic novels is very limited, Pankaj.
Oh,
unfortunately,
yes,
I have read only a few graphic novels, and that is a genre that I'm yet to catch up with. Probably someday I will. But
Thank you, sir.
Yes, you can definitely make use of that. Yes, certainly.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
If there is no other question, we will come to the last part of the webinar, that is vote of thanks. I, on behalf of the English department, Lakhimpur Girls College, as well as Lakhimpur Girls College family as a whole, offer my heartfelt thanks to Professor Debarshi Nath. Sir, this is really enlightening. It is an enlightening experience for all of us. And your scholarly discourse was really great. as you refer to different writers, different texts across time from the past as well as from the present. I hope the participants will be definitely benefited by this. It was a very timely topic to discuss. And I also thank all the participants from this college and other institutions who participated and asked many valuable questions. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
We will issue certificates of participation within 2 weeks, 2 days. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nath.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.